17 children in all had by his parents. So his parents weren't particularly wealthy, and having so many children, I clearly was not going to get any wealthier. So he really did have to go out on his own and forge his own success, which he did extremely well. But at his core, Franklin is a representation, or he's an embodiment of the Enlightenment. And what I mean by that is he was constantly seeking truth. He was constantly seeking knowledge. He was constantly trying to push the boundaries of knowledge and understanding. And we see that if you look at all those different roles that he played in his life: inventor, diplomat, businessman. You really get a sense of what the Enlightenment did. Was, for somebody like Franklin, it pushed him to go beyond all the traditional boundaries. If he had been left to, if he had followed the course that his father had set out for him, he wouldn't have done all the things that he did. But instead, through that seeking of knowledge and learning, he was able to do great things. And he, as I said, is the embodiment of the American narrative. That is, he goes from a very low standing to a very prominent standing throughout his life. He is able, if we were to look at a list of his accomplishments, that in itself would take hours to cover, because there was just so many of them, right? Even as an inventor, his list of inventions are substantial. The lightning rod, that rod on every building that, when the building is struck by lightning, grounds the lightning so that the building doesn't catch on fire, that was Ben Franklin. And what did Ben Franklin do with such a creation, with such an invention? He gave it away for free. He put it into the public domain, saying, this is something for the greater good. I want people to be able to have this so that people's lives aren't at stake in the safety of their homes. He was also one of the earlier writers within this genre that we know as autobiography. There are certainly other people that have written their autobiographies prior to him, but he's one of the most popular ones. He's one of the ones in which we start to see some of the genre conventions start to take place, and I think just because of the nature of it, he's writing his autobiography for his son, so his son learns the lessons that that Franklin himself had been exposed to. And what we see in so much of his work, whether it's in his writing here or elsewhere throughout his life, is that he's very methodical and he takes a scientific approach. And of course, this is just that invoking the Enlightenment. This is I will set to do these tasks, and I will set to do them in this way, and if it does not work, then I will try this way. Right? This idea of creating theses and then enacting on them and trying to work through to find out what is the real truth, or what is the best way to do something. So the autobiography itself has its own interesting publication history. The first part of the biography, there's 4 parts to it, and the first part was actually published in France in 1791, and then that same part was published in English in 1793. And part of the reason for that is just that Franklin's connection with France was substantial. He spent many years over in France negotiating relationships with the French in order to help the American colonies gain support from the French in order to win the American Revolution. The first 3 parts were published in full together in 1818, which is almost 30 years, or 25 years after, or 28 years after Franklin's death. And then the full text with parts 1 through 4 is published in 1868. So therein we see, 78 years later, finally the full book. But the first few, we have part 1 published and parts 1 through 3 published early on. And you can see on the right is, just one of the earlier editions. This is the 1793 English version. On the right, that image of the front piece. So let's take a look at what this autobiography includes. I just want to identify a couple different passages that I think are worth noting to help us think about Benjamin Franklin. There's a lot we could talk about with Benjamin Franklin. I think it's, there's some really good documentaries out there that kind of give you a summation of his life, but I just want to hit upon a few things that I found that I think are important. The library afforded me the means of improvement by constant study, for which I set apart an hour or two each day, and thus repaired in some degree the loss of the learned education my father once intended for me. So what does Ben Franklin do? Ben Franklin goes to, for long stretches of his life, of his early life, he goes to the library for 1 to 2 hours to read. And just spend that time reading and learning and gathering more information. So he doesn't have formal education, but that doesn't bar him from, still seeking knowledge and still looking to improve his circumstance. And I think that's one of the things that, as we talk about that American narrative, that rags to riches, that self-reliance, right, he does not allow those things that are denied to him to stop him from growing. Reading was the only amusement I allowed myself. I spent no time in taverns, games, or frolics of any kind, and my industry and my business continued as indefatigable as it was necessary. I from thence considered industry as a means of obtaining wealth and distinction, which encouraged me, though I did not think that I should ever literally stand before kings, which, however, since has happened. For I stood before 5, and even had the honor of sitting down with one, the King of Denmark, for dinner. So, what we see here is Franklin, he's setting up, or he's informing his son of what he did in order to succeed. And so, for him, it was industry was the only means of obtaining wealth and distinction. And that seems to make sense today, but it didn't always make sense. Industry meant having to do a lot of work. It meant having to be, a good thinker and all of that. And this is the 1700s. People are still inheriting wealth. People are still looking to marry into wealth. There's lots of other, there's lots of other ways besides industry to acquire wealth. But Franklin is saying, no, this is the route I took. I took to reading, right? I only allowed myself to read. And if you think about reading as an amusement, it's absolutely fascinating. Much of our other amusement requires us giving something to get something besides time, right? So if you go to taverns, you got to buy drinks. If you're playing games, in that case, or in any case, that would require, buying the equipment, or that would require owning or renting a space to play the game. And frolics of any kind, well, you can take that for what it is. But, reading as entertainment, even today, is one of the few amusements in which you do not have to give anything to get anything. Or to get a lot, rather, right? You can get a lot from reading in terms of entertainment, in terms of knowledge, but you don't have to give anything besides time. And in fact, for any entertainment, you have to give time, but for much of the rest of our entertainment, we have to give something. We have to pay in some degree. But the abundance of the written word means you could not have to pay for your reading, where you do have to pay for the other things. So here we have Franklin really talking about reading and industry as his means of success that eventually put him before kings. So again, and we understand that that's again an American value of putting yourself to work, pulling yourself up by bootstraps to achieve success. I have been religiously educated as a Presbyterian, and though some of the dogmas of that persuasion, such as the eternal decrees of God, election, reprobation, etc., are to me unintelligible, others doubtful, and I early absented myself from the public assemblies of the sect, Sunday being my studying day. I never was without religious principles. Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, many of the people that are the founders of this country had been exposed to religion. They weren't necessarily religious, but as Franklin says, I was never without religious principles. Many of them were deists, and all that means is they believe a deist is somebody who believes there is a higher being, but does not necessarily believe you have to hop through all of the hoops that many denominations of Christians demand, right? Going to church, doing this sacrament, doing this. They saw that God did exist, and they believed it was most likely a male God, but that he wasn't lording over every little move that was made. The goal was to have those religious principles and to help them to guide you, but they wouldn't be ones who believe that you should have the 10 Commandments in all public areas or things like that. They recognized that, or they believed they were on their own to create a moral and a well-run world, but not one in which is lorded over by Christian beliefs. I never doubted for an instant the existence of the deity, that he made the world and governed it by his providence, that the most acceptable service of God was the doing good to man, that our souls are immortal, and that all crime will be punished and virtue rewarded either here or after. So he's not saying that he doubts these things. He's not saying that there is a deity. And again, he uses the word deity, which is a direct call to deitism, right? By saying deity and not God, he's saying I'm of that strain of deitism in which I believe there is that God, there is those big things happen, but we are not under strict control. These I esteem the essentials of every religion, in being to be found in all religions we had in our country. I respected them all, though with different degrees of respect, right? And there's Franklin being witty, right? I respect them all, but different degrees of respect. I found them more or less mixed with other articles, which, without any tendency to inspire, promote, or confirm morality, serve principally to divide us and make us unfriendly to one another. So here's where we get Franklin critical of religion, and as he says, all of these things are in every religion. These are the essentials of every religion. But I find, or this is him saying that he found that a lot of these different religions and their specific articles, right, those specific elements of each individual denomination created more strife than they did the actual essentials of that religion, which is, of course, the good deeds, which is, be loving one another and stuff like that. So he's calling into question religion as an organization, or the various religious organizations, and the ways in which they create more strife in a lot of instances than they do actually peace and love. So later on in the autobiography, we have Franklin set forward on this task that is completely out of the Enlightenment, right? He says, "It was about this time that I conceived the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. I wished to live without committing any fault at any time. I would conquer all that either natural inclination, custom, or company might lead me to." This is an extremely egocentric task, or egotistical task, right? Franklin says, all right, I'm going to try and be morally perfect. And that is impossible to do. You can aspire to it, and it's great to aspire to it, but to actually achieve it. But because he's this, he is of the Enlightenment age, he believes in kind of being able to find a way, a path, the route to the knowledge, he believes he can do it. And of course he finds, as I knew or thought I knew what was right and wrong, I did not see why I might not always do the one and avoid the other. But I soon found I had undertaken a task of more difficulty than I imagined. While my care was employed in guarding against one fault, I was often surprised by another. Habit took the advantage of inattention. Inclination was sometimes too strong for reason. And I think we could all learn a lesson from Ben Franklin. We are continually, as individuals, trying to be as best as we can, and yet we still make mistakes, right? We are trying to be a good student, and then we mess up and we're a bad friend. We are trying to be a good person in charity, and then we do so and we ignore our family needs. We're constantly trying to be good in all the ways that we can be good. And in doing so, we often make mistakes. I think this is a valuable lesson to be aware of, not just for ourselves, but for how we judge others. We so often, and I think that this is part of what Franklin is touching upon here, we so often are easy to judge a person. Oh, I can't believe that person did that. And we fixate on what they did wrong, but we don't actually consider in the larger picture, where was that person's focus? Was that person trying, to do something else right, or was focused somewhere else on doing right? I concluded at length that the mere speculative conviction that it was our interest to be